Alright, so today we are diving into a PlayStation 2 racing game that genuinely left me quite confused, slightly amused, and definitely questioning some of the design decisions along the way. Welcome to the Worst Racing Games, the internet series where you guys suggest different racing games that you think are terrible, and then I play them, review them, and rank them. Last week we had the frankly not very good classic British motor racing, and this week the wheel has decided we are playing Car Racing Challenge. Now on paper, this sounds incredibly straightforward. You hear a name like that and your brain immediately fills in the blanks. You know, proper racing, maybe some circuits, maybe some kind of career mode, licensed cars, progression, championships, you know, all the usual stuff you'd expect from a mid-2000s racing game. Except literally none of that is actually here, because Car Racing Challenge might genuinely have one of the most misleading titles, and honestly, while we're at it, one of the most misleading covers I've seen in a very long time. And the more time you spend with it, to be honest, the stranger it actually gets. So today we're going to break this thing down properly. We're going to talk about what the game is, what it isn't, which is a lot of things, how it plays, what works, what really doesn't work, and ultimately find out where the game is going to sit on our worst racing games tier list. Because buried underneath all the confusion and jank, maybe there is something here. I'm just not entirely sure it's what the developers intended, so let's get into it. So, Car Racing Challenge originally released in 2004 in Japan before making its way over to Europe in 2006. It was developed by Tamsoft, a studio that actually has a bit of a track record when it comes to arcade-style driving games. They're probably best known for the Koro Q series, also known as Penny Racers here in Europe. Now, those games had a very distinct identity. They were colourful, quirky, a bit silly, but importantly, they were so much fun. They knew exactly what they were trying to be, and they definitely leaned into that. Car Racing Challenge is also different, but instead of feeling intentionally quirky, it just kind of feels confused. The game was published here in the UK by 505 Game Street, which later became part of 505 Games, a company that nowadays is associated with much more polished racing experiences like the Assetto Corsa series. So there's a very strange contrast here. On the one hand, you've got highly detailed realistic driving sims, and on the other you've got this bizarre experimental PS2 title that barely fits into the genre it claims to belong to. And before we even boot the game up, we need to talk about the box art, because this is where things immediately start to feel off. The cover features what looks like a Porsche in full racing livery, something that suggests a fairly serious racing experience. You'd expect maybe licensed cars, some track-based competition, maybe even something resembling motorsport authenticity. And of course, as I'm sure you can probably guess, none of that exists here. There are no licensed cars, there isn't even a car that looks remotely like the one on the cover of the game, and perhaps most importantly, there is no actual racing. At all. So right from the start, the game is setting expectations that it has absolutely no intention of meeting, which is certainly a bold choice. Anyway, let's get going. So the first thing you're greeted with is of course the main menu, and honestly it's about as bare bones as it gets. There's what appears to be a single static image of a car in the background, and a logo that genuinely looks like it could have been put together in Microsoft Paint in a very short amount of time. There's no animation, no transitions, no sense of style. It's just a static screen with options layered on top. It feels more like a placeholder than a finished menu. Your options are New Game, Continue, Options, Save, and Load, and that's it. No extras, no bonus content, no unlockables hinted at, no gallery, time trials. You know what I'm trying to say, there's nothing there. It's very minimal, and while that's not necessarily a bad thing, it does give the impression that the game isn't going to offer much beyond its core experience. And as it turns out, that impression is very accurate. So you hit New Game, and surprisingly, you're greeted with a cutscene. And I'll give the game some credit here, it actually does a decent job of setting things up. It's very early 2000s in style, with some dramatic narration, and that unmistakable tone that games from that era often had. But the real surprise is the story itself, because instead of being a racer, you are a private detective. Yes, that's right, so in Car Racing Challenge, You are not a driver trying to win races, you're a detective trying to solve cases. Specifically, your goal is to gather evidence to prove the innocence of a woman who's been framed by a corrupt politician. Which is already a pretty wild premise for a game that presents itself as a racing title. But then the game adds another twist. You have 4 hours to do this. And that's not in-game time, that's real time. 4 hours of actual time. So from the moment you start playing, the clock is ticking in the real world. You've got 4 actual hours to reach Tokyo and present the evidence before the trial begins. And that's the entire setup. It's genuinely one of the most unexpected premises I've come across in a game like this, and for a brief moment it actually does feel quite intriguing. You start to think, oh okay, maybe this is going to be something different, maybe there's a unique idea here. And, well, there is, it's just not quite executed in the best way. So naturally you might be wondering what other modes the game offers, because even if the story mode is the main focus, you'd expect at least a few additional options. Maybe a quick play mode, or some challenges, or just something to add some replay value, but no. There is just one mode, and that is the story mode. Everything in the game revolves around this single experience. There are no alternative ways to play, no variations on the formula, and no additional content to unlock. So if you don't enjoy the core gameplay loop, there's literally nothing else to fall back on outside of just ejecting the disc out of your PS2. And that definitely puts a lot of pressure on that core experience to carry the entire game. Now before we talk about the game itself, if you haven't done so already, please consider hitting that subscribe button and tapping the bell for notifications to stay up to date with my future uploads. And if you'd like to get your hands on some extra goodies or just support the channel further, then check out my Patreon using the link in the description below, where you could get early access to videos, your name in the credits of every upload, and some other cool bits and bobs. Anyway, thanks for listening to me sell myself, let's move on to the actual gameplay. So the game is split into 6 levels, and each one involves driving along a highway toward Tokyo. That's your main objective, to keep moving forward. But instead of racing opponents, your goal is to collect evidence, and I guess race against the clock as well. And the way you collect evidence is by crashing into specific cars that are carrying it. Once you've disabled the car, you get out your vehicle, run over to it on foot, and pick up the evidence, which is already a pretty unusual mechanic. It immediately shifts the game away from being a traditional driving experience and into something that feels more like a hybrid. Part driving, part action, part whatever this actually is. And while you're doing all this, you're also being pursued by the police, because they are also corrupt and under the command of the politician. They will chase you, try to ram you, set up barricades along the road to slow you down. So now you've got this constant balancing act. You're trying to collect evidence, avoid police, and keep moving forward all at the same time to stay ahead of the clock. And then the game adds another layer on top of that. Every car in the game has both health and fuel, so as you're driving you are constantly managing both. Take too much damage and your car becomes slower and harder to control and will just eventually explode. Run low on fuel and of course you will just come to a stop. Which means you need to find a new car, and the way you do that is by stealing one from the traffic around you. You just pull up next to a car, get out, kick the person out of the next car, and take it. No resistance, no real consequences, just get in and drive off. The cars themselves vary quite a bit. You've got smaller, faster vehicles, some family type vehicles like estate cars, and then larger, slower ones like lorries, and pretty much everything in between. Each one handles slightly differently, but the differences aren't particularly deep. And as your car takes damage, as I say, its performance degrades, your top speed drops and handling becomes less responsive. And in some cases you'll even develop fuel leaks, which forces you to switch vehicles more frequently. And then the game introduces one of its strangest mechanics. Sometimes when you steal a car, it's just like broken. You might get one with no steering, or one with no brakes. Which is obviously ridiculous, but also kind of funny. Because it makes absolutely no sense, because how are they even driving that car, especially if the steering was broke, before you got into it? Why was it on the road? These are questions the game of course does not care to answer, and honestly, that kind of sums up the overall design philosophy of the game. So across these 6 levels, you are essentially repeating the exact same gameplay loop. Drive forward, dodge traffic, collect evidence, avoid police, switch cars, repeat. And visually, the levels are almost identical. They are all long stretches of highway with very little variation in scenery. Now, to be fair, the game does attempt to kind of introduce some variety. A couple of levels feature heavier traffic, which is really annoying. One level has fog, and another includes rain. But these changes are fairly minor, and they don't really alter the gameplay all that much. If anything, the fog level is probably the most enjoyable simply because it hides some of the game's more obvious visual shortcomings, which brings us nicely along to this game is incredibly janky, and I don't mean that in a harsh way, it's just the best way to describe it. Collision detection is very inconsistent. You'll hit invisible barriers, especially along the walls and environment. Sometimes you'll clip through stuff or bounce off things in ways that don't feel quite right. The handling can be quite unpredictable. Some cars feel okay, others feel like they're sliding around constantly, and the damage system is extremely exaggerated. Even small collisions can have massive effects, which can be both frustrating and unintentionally hilarious. And then there's the pop-in. Objects, cars, even parts of cars don't fully load until you're quite close to them. So you'll often see things just suddenly appear, which makes the world feel just a bit unstable. And here's the interesting part. For a while it is actually kind of fun. There is a certain charm to that janky chaos. The unpredictability, the weird physics, and the strange mechanics. They all combine to create moments that are genuinely entertaining. You will laugh at the game, you will question what's happening, and for the first hour or so, that's enough. But after that, the novelty definitely starts to wear off. So the traffic and police AI are very simple. Traffic follows predictable patterns for the most part, with some occasional swerves, but nothing too dynamic. The police behave similarly. They'll chase you, try to block you, but they're not particularly aggressive and certainly not very intelligent. Once you understand how they work, they become very easy to deal with. In fact, you can sometimes just get out of your car and run past them, or even punch them out the way, which is again completely ridiculous, but very much in line with the rest of the game. It does make the overall challenge feel just a bit inconsistent though. Sometimes things feel chaotic, and sometimes they feel almost trivial. Speaking of, visually the game is underwhelming. Even by PS2 standards, the car models are fairly basic, the environments are incredibly repetitive, and there's very little visual variety across the 6 levels. Everything starts to blend together after just about 10 minutes. The pop-in definitely doesn't help either, it just makes the whole thing feel much less polished. That said, there are occasional moments where the atmosphere does work. The fog and fairly unimpressive rain effects at least add a bit of mood. But overall, this is not a game you're going to remember for how it looks. And whilst we're on the topic of design, the sound design is functional. Engines at least sound like engines, collisions sound like collisions. There's nothing particularly impressive, but nothing terrible either. It does its job. The soundtrack, however, is actually kinda good. There aren't many tracks, but there are a couple that stand out with a kind of upbeat, quirky energy. One track in particular feels like something you'd hear in a DS brain training game. Light and slightly out of place in the best way. It's easily one of the more memorable aspects of the game. Interestingly, there's almost no information available about how this game was received. No major reviews, no significant coverage, no sales data. It's as if the game just quietly released and just disappeared, which, given everything we've discussed, does make a lot of sense. So now the time has come to rank Car Racing Challenge on our worst racing games tier list. Now, despite all the jank and let's face it, the very misleading title and cover art, This is a genuinely really unique driving video game experience. I have never actually played a game quite like this. Is it that good? No, but is it that bad? No. It's definitely a very unique experience, and for that alone, I am going to rank this one as actually not that bad. It's definitely not good enough to qualify for the very top, but just based on its ideas and some of the execution, it is actually a lot of fun. So is it worth playing today? Well, it depends what you're into. Probably not for most people, but as a curiosity, or as a weird kind of broken piece of gaming history, it's very fascinating. Because games like this, the kind of weird and experimental ones, they stick with you. Not always because they're great, but because they are different. And boy is Car Racing Challenge definitely different. Just not in the way its name suggests. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our look at Car Racing Challenge, and with it, this week's episode of Worst Racing Games. Would you rank this game any differently? What do you think of it? Share all your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, if you have a suggestion you want to see added to that wheel, pop that down there as well. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to leave a like, and if you haven't done so already, consider hitting that subscribe button and tapping the bell for notifications. A massive shout out to my Patreon subscribers for the continued support, and all I really have left to say is thank you and goodbye.